caused the Hawaii fires? Was it systemic neglect and infrastructural failure, which means it's their fault? Or is it climate change, which means it's your fault, you'll be paid for it, you'll be banged up? Hello there, you 6.5 million awakening wonders. Thanks for joining us on our voyage to truth and freedom, a process of mutual awakening where we inform one another of what we're learning and we remain open-minded in spite of mainstream narratives that are distracting and sometimes downright dishonest. We've all been shocked and appalled by the Hawaii fires, and it's interesting to learn that the cause could be infrastructural, i.e. electrical failures, lack of investment, failure of local government, and indeed federal government. Of course, as soon as these fires happened, many people thought this could be because of climate change, and it will almost certainly be blamed on climate change. Whatever your opinion on climate change is, you surely, like me, must be curious that all of the solutions presented seem to be favourable to centralised authority and beneficial to certain interests, and usually come down to impeding your personal freedom. Let's have a look at this story and look at how appallingly Joe Biden is handling this mess.
Wow, he's finally here! Wow, yeah, awesome. Yeah, thanks for nothing. Fuck you.
Some distance from aloha.
Fuck you.
It's interesting because the mainstream media will have trouble repackaging these disaster victims as sort of pro-Trump MAGA haters, but if they have to do that, they will.
Fuck you! Hey, wait, fuck you, Joe Biden, fuck you!
In a sense, from the perspective of news reporting, it's easy to note that if something supports their agenda, they'll promote it. If it doesn't, they'll ignore it. These reactions are comparable to the post-Hurricane Katrina reactions, where people were disgusted with the state, felt let down by the infrastructure that was in place. The fact that these protests are being largely ignored tells you how this event is being framed.
So why aren't you taking care of what you claim to be in charge of, rather than sending out all these funds and whatever else you guys are sending to Ukraine or anywhere? Take care of here first. You know, I don't see why any president wouldn't step up and take care of what's part of their, territory.
This disaster, like many disasters or crises, is revealing. It's very difficult not to see that shot and think, yeah, that's a situation that requires public amenities and public funding. This is exactly the type of situation that your tax dollars are meant to go towards resolving. It's a stretch to say that international incidents require American intervention because there's culpability and responsibility. What? Because of imperialism, colonialism, because of an American global agenda, because of a geopolitical situation that may one day benefit American interests? Surely all of us make a contract with the government that we pay our taxes, you one way or another take care of us, whether it's through ongoing infrastructure, schools, roads, hospitals, name your priorities. But in particular, if there is a disaster, a situation that requires immediate attending to, the resources are there. The concept of nation is an expansion on the concept of tribe or family. And if there's a crisis in a family, it's nice to know that the resources are there to take care of it. And more than the resources, the willingness. How is this situation being handled? And what does it tell us about what the nation of America, or at least the American establishment, stands for?
I don't want to compare difficulties, but
it's always reassuring to know that the nation is being led by a cogent, cognizant, mindful, fluent, and brilliant politician who'll be able to use his political experience and even family experiences to soothe the suffering people who are just coming out of a massive national emergency and are going to need to hear some words of compassion, empathy, and above all, wisdom.
we have a little sense, Jill and I, what it's like to lose a home. Years ago, now 15 years ago, I was in Washington doing Meet the Press. It was a sunny Sunday.
I maintain that Joe Biden believes that he has a kind of homespun, folky warmth that he can rely on in times of crisis. I don't think he does possess this ability, because often when he uses these anecdotes about stuff that happened to him when he was a kid or normal family stories, it doesn't come across as, oh yeah, he's a person just like me, it comes across as this guy's really, really dangerously out of touch and has misjudged the mood, not only of the nation, but also like what the human psyche is and what it is to be in a situation of crisis. Like, you do not say to people who have just come through a massive fire that's devastated their homes, I once nearly had something happen to me before. You don't say to Nelson Mandela as he emerged from Robben Island after 27 years of incarceration, I know how you feel because I got trapped in an elevator once.
And lightning struck at home on a little lake that's outside of our home, not a lake, a big pond.
You can't even accurately describe the body of water that's outside his home. Is it a pond? Is it like, listen, this ukulele's starting to feel quite heavy. Can you hurry up, please?
And hit a wire and came up underneath our home into the heating ducts, the air conditioning duct. To make a long story short,
To make an inappropriate story appropriate, I was feeling quite bad about my children burning to death, but God, tell me that your air conditioning unit was all right after your big pond nearly got into the circuit.
I almost lost my wife, my 67 Corvette, and my cat.
I think the important word in this anecdote is almost. Any anecdote that includes the word almost to people that have actually suffered in a terrible fire is an inappropriate one. Look, I know you're still reeling from your children being burned to death, but you see that 67 Corvette? Yeah, I can see it. Well, you might not have been able to if what had nearly happened had actually. Anyway, I'm going to get in it now. Bye!
Well, while life in West Maui remains uncertain, one thing is for sure.
That place is devastated. That requires immediate intervention. Say if they went on the news in the same way they were at the beginning of the Ukraine-Russia war, went, there's a terrible crisis in Hawaii, we've got to intervene, what should we do? This is our suggestion, we're going to set up these programs, these plans. Now, I'm sure elsewhere they go, no, people are doing exactly that, but we know that much more money is being spent perpetuating war for the military-industrial complex. We know much more money is spent supporting pharmaceutical companies. We know that the system is set up to be advantageous in times of crisis to elite establishment institutions and barely benefit ordinary people. We know that, and actually we can see it.
Residents are furious over the local government's response. You see, typically, when there's a fire, you use water to put it out. But Maui's Department of Land and Natural Resources delayed the release of water to landowners to help protect their property from the wildfire. In fact, they even disputed the release of water for hours after the West Maui Land Company made a request to release it.
Part of the subtext of this story is that the disaster will impact poor people more than it will rich people. There are even some suggesting that resources were not used expediently and immediately. That most basic of resource that's required during a fire, water, was withheld, and people are curious as to why that might have been. At this point, it will be irresponsible to suggest anything conspiratorial, but when it becomes plain that our social systems benefit the privileged more than ordinary people, you can't help but wonder if that same mentality applied when deciding what to do with this water.
Maui survivors are even telling reporters they had to grab water out of their toilets to fend off the flames.
I was grabbing water out of the toilet. I was grabbing water out of my Brita filter in the refrigerator. It's a kind of disconcerting feeling when the fire guys show up and they don't have water.
Fire department, sir, can we have access to your toilet? This isn't even a hose.
Officials neglected their duties to protect the people they claimed to represent. They had other priorities. Just like in 2019, when Hawaiian Electric vowed to invest in fire-resistant technology, now that same company is under heavy scrutiny over indication that its power lines may have ignited the wildfires that has now taken over 100 lives. And the people of the once beautiful town of Lahaina, many of them are left to fend for themselves and their neighbors with very little answers and a whole lot of miscommunication. And now they have to fight off vulture capitalists from tricking people into buying their property.
Oh, bloody hell, what a terrible, awful story. There hasn't been sufficient investment in infrastructure. There are areas of public life that ought never have been made private, that should have remained within public control, that were given over to profit-pursuing enterprises. And now, in the midst of this terrible disaster, vulture realtors are trying to acquire their property. Isn't this somewhat comparable to some of the things we learned during the pandemic? It was a disaster and a crisis for most people to varying degrees, perhaps dependent on your economic conditions and your general health. But it was hugely beneficial to a particular strata. Billionaires became richer. Big tech became richer. Big pharma benefited. And in a more localized disaster like this one, it's easy to see how this might be beneficial to certain interests while penurious for ordinary people. We got a brief commercial message for you now from our reliable sponsors. If their product's of any use to you, please use it. I'll try and make it funny. Thank you.
I'm on the internet right now. You're on the internet right now. But who else knows you are?
If you've messaged anybody this week, would you share with us the names of the people you've messaged?
Senator, no, I would probably not choose to do that publicly here.
What's playing out now at big tech companies and social media sites sets a dangerous precedent. Have you ever wondered how free to access tech giants make their money? Have you? Have you wondered? Well, it's by tracking your searches, your video history, and everything you click on, then selling off your sensitive data. When you use ExpressVPN, you anonymize your online presence by hiding your IP address. That makes your activity more difficult to trace and sell. Whatever you're looking at, I'm not judging you. That's your business. If you want to look at that, it don't matter. Looking at our most private of places, our nooks, our crannies, our crevices. Oh no, you effing well didn't. Not now we just ExpressVPN'd you right where it hurts. One revolutionary tool we can start with right now is stopping the Googles, the Facebooks, the Alphabets and the Sesame Streets from spying on our most intimate nooks. I bloody well won't have it, and neither should you. Click on the link below. Visit expressvpn.com/brand, and then you can be like me, fighting against injustice everywhere. Stay free.
Some of the things that's already been happening is realtors are calling families who lost everything, offering them to buy their property and their home for pennies on the dollar, just pennies on the dollar. So it's pretty offensive to us that people won't even give us the time to grieve properly.
In a way, disasters can be regarded as revelatory. They show us what was previously concealed. And in this instance, it shows that there was an exploitative, corrupt, and inept system undergirding Hawaiian life. And now that's being revealed to us. Similarly, what's being revealed is there's no infrastructure in terms of our ability to collectively respond, or at least no willingness, certainly not the same willingness that appears to be applied when there are more profitable disasters or disasters that can be exploited for corporate gain. So how will this disaster be used in the media? How will it be exploited economically? And how will it be used to advance ideas and agenda that are favourable to the establishment? This is from Michael Schellenberger's Substack Public. Climate change caused the fire that ravaged Hawaii, according to the New York Times. Climate change turned lush Hawaii into a tinderbox, it reported. The explanation is as straightforward as it is sobering. As the planet heats up, no place is protected from disasters. But the cause of the strong winds, which pushed the wildfires into the city of Lahaina, was Hurricane Dora, and the best available science shows no increase in hurricanes at global or national levels. It's true that there's been a 31% decline in average yearly rainfall in Hawaii since 1990, according to researchers. The La Niña weather pattern, which usually leads to significant rainfall, has brought less precipitation over the last 40 years. But other changes are more difficult to tie to the rise in global temperatures, such as the fact that larger storms have been moving northward, resulting in less rainfall. And only 16% of Maui County, where most of the wildfires were burning, has been in severe drought, with another 20% in moderate drought. What's more, it's been human-made changes to the landscape, including the reversion of former sugarcane farms, which had been irrigated to invasive grasses which are quick to ignite. The landscape is just covered with flammable stuff, one expert told The Times. All of the conditions just came together. Analysts found drops to power line voltage, which means that the lines were likely spraying sparks onto dry grasses. It is unambiguous that Hawaiian Electric's grid experienced immense stress for a prolonged time, said one analyst. There were dozens and dozens of major faults on the grid, and any one of those could have been the ignition source for a fire. Hawaiian Electric failed to clear flammable grasses from around electric wires. Over the last 3 years, the electric utility spent less than $250,000 into wildfire prevention. It had a plan, but it failed to implement it, noted Lee Fang. The State Utility Commission dragged its feet on upgrades to Lahaina's fire protection, with a time estimate for wildfire protection upgrades starting this year and completed in 2027. If this is a result of infrastructural neglect, particularly if that infrastructure is privately owned and driven by profit and is therefore cutting costs and not investing significantly in, for example, safe lines and clearing grasses, that leads you to very different conclusions than it was caused by the planet heating up and anthropogenic climate change. One of those theories leads to more control being asserted on ordinary citizens. The other theory means that there has to be more investment in infrastructure, more accountability, and more accountability in government. One of those theories will be promoted, the other one will be largely ignored for obvious reasons. If the problem is government and corporate greed, what kind of solutions suggest themselves? More accountability from government, the ability to control private utility. If it's climate change, 15-minute cities, you've got to recycle more, it's essentially your fault, and just a general culture of fear which can be utilised to generate and implement control. So those theories have very different outcomes. Personally, I believe that respect and love for the planet and doing everything possible to ensure that the planet is treated favourably and respectfully is just plain common sense. But I note that whenever climate change arguments are leveraged, it's usually with the aim of controlling ordinary people's actions rather than making big business or the state more generally culpable. I was already fighting with the electric company because they never maintain the lines, said a fifth-generation Hawaii resident who lives on a family farm. We were very concerned that these high-voltage lines were running through our property and going to our neighbours because they'd been on the ground, buried in trees or lying so low. And it's now clear that a Hawaii state water official named M. Kaleo Manuel delayed the release of water to landowners who wanted it to prevent fires. The water standoff played out over much of the day, reported Stuart Yerton of Honolulu City Beat, and the water didn't come until too late. Another example of infrastructural failure and prioritisation that seems at odds with the needs of ordinary people. Firefighters didn't have the water they needed because Manuel, the Deputy Director for Water Resources of Hawaii's Department of Land and Natural Resources, refused to release water even as the fire was raging. It seems as that situation demanded immediate reprioritisation and response. So now we're looking at potential corporate greed and government ineptitude as the causes of this fire, or at least conditions that made the consequences of the fire worse. A private landowner, the West Maui Land Co., which manages 3 of West Maui's water providers, said its firefighters asked the state to divert water from streams to enable them to store as much water as possible for fire control. If there are favourable relationships between corporations and the state, those are the kind of things that are not implausible. They're quite possible, even likely. Why is that? Why did Hawaiian Electric fail to implement its wildfire mitigation plan? And why did Manuel refuse to release the water? To a large extent, the apocalyptic claims made about climate change by people in developed nations reflect their ignorance of the infrastructure and practices that protect us from flood control to baseload power plants to forest management. They take civilization for granted. At least that is, until it fails, as it is increasingly starting to do. Elizabeth Pickett, co-executive director of the non-profit Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, told the Wall Street Journal that measures like ramping up emergency response capacity have been stymied by lack of funding, logistical hurdles in rugged terrain, and competing priorities. What are these other priorities? While the US government, backed by the corporate media, continuously claims there is no money to build infrastructure and take measures that will prevent such disasters from happening in the first place, there is an endless supply of funds for war and financial bailouts of the banks and corporations. We've all noticed that. We've all experienced that from 2008 onwards. Resources are made available for particular crises, financial and military, but they're not made available for domestic disasters such as this one. It's almost like, in microcosm, the diversion of that water and the use of that water tells you how the system works. Private interests that have close connections with the government are able to divert resources and funds to their favour. It seems to me that in a real democracy, you would be able to determine where resources are allocated. Do you want them spent domestically? Would you like funds available when there are disasters? Or do you want perennial war that are beneficial to certain establishment interests? The US government, through both Democratic and Republican administrations over the past 3 decades, has spent trillions of dollars on imperialist wars that have killed and displaced millions of people, and at the same time funneled similar amounts into the financial system to ensure that money-making for billionaires on Wall Street continued without disruption. And yet, the response of the political establishment has been an astounding degree of disinterest and the shrinking of any responsibility for the disaster. Joe Biden earned more criticism for being out of touch with Americans during his stop in Maui Monday, including scorn for providing $700 assistance checks. The White House announced that each affected household in Hawaii will receive a $700 check to address immediate needs, including water, food and clothing, but it's a sum that many islanders consider insulting. The level of dismay, anger and distrust of the government is palpable within the population of Maui. This disaster and tragedy is revelatory in a number of ways. It shows that at least in part these fires were caused or exacerbated by government ineptitude, by a bias towards corporate interests instead of the needs of the community. And in the response of the American government, we can see how our institutions are organised in terms of what is prioritised. And with ugly details like the vulture realtors swooping down to profit from the situation, it is made even clearer that our culture is in need of radical review. It's not unreasonable to expect that if you're a taxpayer and a citizen of a nation, that in times of crisis and disaster, there are resources made available to you to help you in a crisis, particularly if that crisis has been made worse by a lack of infrastructure and maybe even caused by it, particularly if privatised electric companies, in order to increase profits, don't spend enough money on maintaining their lines or clearing the ground, and particularly if water isn't made available because they have other priorities rather than putting out urgent conflagrations. And the fact that the mainstream media will, when reporting on this story, focus on the climate change narrative rather than ineptitude within the state and private sector, in a sense tells you everything you need to know about the modern world. Our systems are not set out to benefit us in times of crisis, or indeed at any time at all. It just becomes clearer when there is a crisis. A crisis functions as a lens that reveals to you how your leaders behave when they're put under pressure, how your institutions behave, what the consequences are of having no public infrastructure, and how the media will rally to ensure that the narrative that sticks is one that doesn't afford us the opportunity to reorganise our systems. Those people shouting, "Fuck you, Joe Biden," they intuitively and indeed empirically now understand what the problems with the American government and American system is. It's set up to benefit one strata of society and one strata of society only, and it becomes more evident in times of crisis that your government doesn't work for you and trickle-down economics doesn't work for you, and in times of emergency that will become candid and stark. And while Joe Biden gives speeches where he pretends that he's just like you because he nearly had a fire once, the fact is that he, as he told the donor class prior to his election, operates on their behalf, and nothing will fundamentally change. As this article says, nothing has fundamentally changed in the last 30 years. The relationship between government and corporations, whether at a local level or a national level, are so entwined that it will take a disaster to reveal how little support for ordinary people there is. And when those disasters come, it's already too late. But that's just what I think. Why don't you let me know what you think in the comments below? If you enjoyed this video, have a look at either of these. Remember, turn on the notification bell and subscribe. And these podcasts are available in audio form. There's a link in the description to guide you towards them. More important than any of that is that you please, if you can, stay free.